Okay, so I don't know if you guys have been following my content lately, but I have been leaving out little teasers that we're going to build up to this wonderful conversation that includes a lot of different experts that influence our working world. And why do I want to do that? It's because a lot of things are changing, and the next generation getting into the workforce, our older generation re-entering into the workforce, how we get work, what we do for work, and our relationship from a legal perspective with our new employees is definitely changing. So that is why I have LaDouglas Johnson here from Stewart Law Group, and I'm so glad to have a conversation with him about his perspective as a legal professional who deals with maybe not the best of humanity at all times. So I want to talk to my first question for you, or maybe my first topic of conversation to get your point of view is, what do you think, if I were to start my very first job, like this is my first job and I'm getting ready to get into the working world, what legal advice would you give me before I even start the relationship?
Well, be transparent. A work relationship is just, there's a lot of similarity between that and other relationships that you have in your life. Make sure you understand what the expectations are. Make sure that if there are contracts that you're signing, you understand what that involves from you and what your expectation is going to be from that employer. So if you've got questions, ask away, because that's the best time to ask, is right at the beginning.
So I have to laugh just a little bit because, not because of what you said necessarily, but I love the simplicity of what you said, and that was that a working relationship should be treated like any other relationship that you have in your life. Well, obviously we do a lot of work with millennials and the up and coming generation, and then what we call is a lot of boomers who are regenerationing themselves in some way, their culture, their style, the way they look at things. And there's this like clash of what to do in a relationship from the beginning, whether it's a dating relationship or working relationship or the relationship with our friends, whatever we do on social media. There's like this collision of what's the right behavior, how do we present ourselves, and sometimes in the job market, I think we've overcomplicated it in some ways. So I guess what I'd like to understand is your perspective on how we can maybe simplify this introduction to each other in a working relationship, that allows us to treat it with the same respect that we would any relationship that we value.
Well, I think one of the ways to simplify it is to break down these imaginary barriers that exist. And the reality is sometimes they're real barriers. Sometimes you are working for an employer or in an environment where they have a level of formality that makes it off-putting to ask a lot of questions. But right out the gate, the best way is to make sure that you know where to go to navigate that and open a line of communication. Because when the line of communication is open, then the expectations can be communicated, and if there is a mismatch, then those areas can be explored. So, you mentioned there's, a difference, and the workforce is changing. We've got boomers, and now we've got the millennials, and so they were raised in different environments as far as the commercial market is concerned, and so they've got different expectations. So one of the, I think, best ways to approach that, because they're not going to be assuming the same things, so there are hidden conflicts that haven't been fleshed out, is to put everything in writing or in digital form so that folks have an opportunity to see it before they start. I think a lot of the issues that people run into is because they didn't understand something that wasn't really explicitly made clear to them when they first started.
So this is the beginning of a relationship. And I have to go back to, we can talk about so many things right now, but I want to stay focused on the being honest and being real.
Right.
Because of the conversations that we get to have with the next generation, we typically hear, are you, and don't laugh at me, we typically hear, are you being 100 with us? And I'm like, sure. I didn't know I needed to say I'm being 100 with you because I'm organically authentic, and I didn't know that they were already skeptical. Like the next generation was already skeptical. Like, you as an employer, you're not really being on the up and up with me. Yeah, you're playing games with me. And then I thought, well, do they do that in their personal relationships? Is like everybody so skeptical about that, so then nobody asks any real questions? I don't know if you have a flavor or opinion on that, but I'm just like, I'm kind of like in shock and awe that in a working relationship, I'm paying you for your time. So you would think that you would want to be as transparent and 100% as you possibly could, but we don't seem to ever get there because we're so worried about being on our best behavior. So what would you recommend from the next generation to be able to get like the truth of whatever is being asked of them, become stewards of their own interview process, be stewards of their own candidate process before that relationship starts?
Well, I think the source of some of that is fear of the unknown. So when someone's getting to know someone else in a relationship, there's a lot of fear because there's a lot of unknown. Are they gonna like my authentic self? Is this relationship with this employer gonna work? Are my expectations so far different from the norm that, very quickly I'm gonna be searching for another place? So there's this fear of not meeting someone's expectation. Like when you meet someone, maybe, well, that's great, I'm interested in that person, but they don't really know the true me, so there's this fear inside, and I think it's both sides. Fear on the employer side and fear for the, inside the employee, the candidate. So they're wondering, so there's this, we match kind of, but is it deeper? And so I think breaking down that fear barrier is part of the process of being authentic. So it may not work. It's not the end of the world. So people from prior generations had the mindset, you get a job, you're going to work there for perhaps your entire life. This is going to be your career. You're going to be there 5 or 10 years. That's not the same today. So folks who are working today have a different expectation in a good way. That, I may work here 2 or 3 years, but this is not the end of my career. And for someone new in their career, perspective is difficult to feel because you don't have it. It's something that people tell you about and try to describe. So it's not something that will come to you naturally to respond in a way that is appropriate for it being your first job or your second job. It's going to take you thinking and stepping back and removing a little bit of the emotions, because the emotions kind of drive you sometimes to make decisions that may not be in your best interest, to ramp up the fear and cause you to not reveal and be 100 or authentic with your employer. Because authenticity on one side breaks down barriers on the other side. So maybe the answer there is to give a little bit of authenticity and say, look, I may have worked someplace before, but I've never worked here. So I have some questions. And I've taken the time to put those questions in paper form so that you can go through them. I want to make sure that, I'm 100 with you, and I want to ask things that I don't know that, in our process of getting matched together, wasn't revealed to me.
Yeah.
So reveal a little bit and you get a little bit. It's kind of a give and take. As
I think
humans,
that takes some courage too.
It does.
And some courage and maturity and, sorry to be frank, but a little bit of balls, because you don't know what you're going to lose on the other side, right?
That's true.
You just have to do that. So,
Yeah.
what just from a context perspective, what we're talking about now is how to set up the right working relationship from the beginning to avoid any legal consequences or fallout. And there's so many other things that happen even before that, before this opportunity to have a conversation about being brave and being 100 with each other. It's called the application process. And so I'm curious to know from a legal perspective, what chance do I have as a candidate today if my job process is 100% automated and I never talk to a human being? Like, how do I, what would be, and maybe a legal context isn't the right question, because you could probably say on the opposite of that, like, what risk scenarios does that set up for a company to not have a equal candidate pool that down the line has discrimination and adverse selection consequences to it? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, the hallmark, the benchmark here is always transparency. So when you've got a process where you're not involving a human and it's totally automated, the candidate is going through that process, you have to have some level of confidence that it's going to explore all the areas that are important for that candidate to make their decision and to give you the information you need to make an informed decision. So, taking out a human is risky because there's so many variables. And as human beings, we have so many different things and different ways of interpreting even the same question. So there's going to be some misalignment already just because people come from different ways of using the English language. We may say the same word and mean something completely different or even slightly different.
That is such a perfect thing from an attorney because the art of your world is words, and people work is spelled phonetically, so we have our own love of words. But I appreciate you being able to point that out because the intention behind our communication, I don't know if it's possible to capture that in a fully automated recruiting process. I mean, I don't know, TBD, but from a legal perspective, is there anything that a candidate who's submitting a process should be mindful of if they find themselves trapped in a fully automated experience, besides opt out and run away? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, you can use context clues, just like we use in regular life when we're talking to, friends or family members or even, folks that we just meet, strangers off the street. We have to pull as much out of the context as we can and look at the history of in this space. Look at the history of the company. What do they mean when they say that? And why should I, or other companies that operate in that same space? Because when you have an automated process without a human to provide that additional explanation, that additional context to give you more meaning about what the process is, or what your responsibilities are, what your expectations are going to be, then you've got to do that work on your own and get the context yourself. And to the extent possible, find out what that company's history has been with regard to a particular question. So when this company says you only get 10 paid time off days, are they counting just those days, or are they lumping in the holidays? Do I get holidays as well? This sounds like a simple question, but it comes up frequently. What do they mean? And so asking folks who work there, that will help as well. Not necessarily folks who are in the HR department, but folks who've actually experienced working with them in that environment. What are their expectations?
So far for our talent in the working world, we want to make sure that they're just aware that they can speak up, that they can have an opportunity to provoke a 100% conversation to make sure expectations are really started from the foundation. 2 is do some due diligence, and that's just an adult word for doing your homework and knowing who's on the slide and who's reputable and all that stuff before you even consider working with them. Because you're right, the competition for jobs is infinite now. It's no longer like one job for I don't even know what the ratio would be. My brain just kind of collapsed right there. One job for every 100 people or whatever. It's like 50 jobs for every one person, right? And those jobs are just so wide and diverse in terms of options. Okay, so great. let's just pretend we're all hired. Everyone's hired, and they all got hired under equitable circumstances and fair, and everybody starts the relationship with clear expectations, or what you thought was clear expectations, and now they're in the house. Like I'm working, I've got my first job, and I am faced with the reality of the reality of the work that I've now elected to be in and the culture that I've been in. Do you think that the current employer-employee relationship is a healthy one?
I think it is in some places, and in some places it's not. And it can be. But in general, I would say yes. For the most part, it's a healthy relationship. But each relationship, it's like what is the state of marriage in America? What is the state of parent-child relationships in America? They still exist. It's not they haven't been made extinct, so I guess I'd say generally good. But that misses a whole lot of meaning, because there's a lot of specifics that go into a particular relationship that you can't generalize about. I'll say there is quite a bit of culture shock for organizations who, for example, may not have an understanding of what the new expectations are, or even in some instances what the new sensibilities and sensitivities are in the workforce. And I've seen situations where perhaps an employment environment is one that is unintentionally misogynistic, or one that unintentionally misgenders, and folks don't even understand that there are sensitivities about that subject, and they offend some of their employees without even knowing. Or they do things that were fine 20 or 30 years ago, but today are totally inappropriate. So there is a little bit, I think, of growing pains, and I think that sort of thing is going to happen as society grows, no matter what, as our values change and evolve over time.
Yeah, it's a cycle.
It's a cycle
that we go through.
Right.
So that I love the way that you frame that. And actually, before we go on, I just want to point out that this is the first attorney that I have ever heard be so relationship based. So I'm sure that you take your work from a relationship based perspective. It sounds like you're really out to say, were we balanced, were we fair, how can we correct things, whether they're your corporate clients come to you or a employee who thinks that they need your services for whatever reason. Did I miss them?
No, yeah, and I think this particular area of law is one that deals heavily in relationships, because in a good way, employment lawyers have an opportunity to correct things sometimes. They're the folks that many companies hire to go in and investigate situations where people have been disgruntled, or when they have a problem, or they think they may have some sort of claim. And employers then ask us, well, what do you recommend? And so there is a lot of relationship understanding that I'm blessed with having to employ in dealing and investigating and understanding situations and how they break down and how they get to be more successful than they are.
That sounds like there's almost a little bit of culture training as well,
yes,
as you kind of unravel some of the mistakes that people make along the way. But let's go back to the comment that you made about the sensitivities of this new environment that we're working under. And I don't know if it's really a new working environment. And maybe that's because I've been in HR for so long. I'm always around sensitive people. I mean, people always come to me with the most sensitive things. For example, we had one person come to me and she was outraged because she was called a bitch. She was called a B word. And I was like, half of me was thinking, well, I get called out on an every other day basis and I have no reaction. That could be my gender. It could be my desensitization, that I should be like over angered by it. Or
how dare you?
Yes, exactly. How dare you?
Right.
Or this really could be a bad situation because I just don't deal with that kind of. I don't receive those kind of, what would you call those? I don't receive those kind of comments as personal all the time, and that maybe have to, again, just because of how I see certain situations. But this was a young adult. Being called the B word is not part of her vocabulary on a regular basis, and the circumstances in which she was called that was in her mind not warranted. But whether it's something as grievous as being called the B word or any other word that is derogatory for race, gender, or sexual orientation, most of the people that aren't aware of this awareness of just different human identities and how people need to be treated with a certain level of respect and kindness, they feel like they're walking on eggshells. So are we really walking on eggshells? Is this more of a culture shock? How do you see, what maybe a good question or conversation to have with you is, do you see the ramifications of people who take it as we're walking on eggshells and this new generation is over demanding and sensitive for everything, versus those situations that they tried to be aware and they still got some sort of consequence? Or like, I'm a job seeker and I thought this was a totally inclusive environment, and now I come in and the first word I hear is something that's offensive to my identity. Now what do I do?
Well, I think that it takes effort. So I love the example you use of, it feels like we're walking on eggshells. So if you visualize that situation, it feels like we're walking on eggshells. You got someone in a room and they're barefoot and there are eggshells scattered and they can't see them. Why can't they see the eggshells? Well, if they would take a glance at the floor, they would know where the eggshells are, and they could easily step around the eggshells should there be eggshells on the floor, right? Then the other thing that they could do is they could clean up the eggshells, right?
Clean up takes a lot of effort for people sometimes.
So I say that because sometimes it takes us effort, one, to identify what is sensitive that we're not aware of. Turn on the lights in the room. Educate yourself, and you won't feel so uncomfortable about not knowing. Because if you're in a room walking barefoot and the lights are off, that's not a smart thing to do. Neither is it smart to remain ignorant about what the fragile sensibilities could be and you're stomping around. So the other part of that is to clean up the eggshells, clean up the language, clean up the culture, for valid things that are sensitive for folks. If you really want to have a workforce that's committed to you, that's going to do a good job for you, and is going to stand up for you in the marketplace, those are the steps you've got to take. You've got to actively look and understand and educate, and then actively clean up those things that need to be cleaned up. There's no way around it. I mean, you have folks who will continually complain about walking on eggshells because they don't want to turn on the lights and they don't want to get out the broom. But that's just it. They don't want to educate themselves. So on the other hand, the employees who these are very serious things, or these are sensitivities that are valid and they feel them deeply, sometimes there is a responsibility on their part to educate those who don't know. Because certainly, if I've never experienced something, I don't understand something in my life, I've never seen something, the only way I learn of it is someone else tells me.
Yeah.
Right? They tell me, hey, that caused a problem for me, that caused me to feel some sort of way. I would like to talk to you about this, or I'd like to ask you about this. Open the door in a way for the employer to become educated. You can turn on the light for your employer so they can see the eggshells. You can't walk into a space and assume that it fits you perfectly. Just like you don't walk into a relationship and assume, oh, that person knows what my favorite ice cream flavor is. Oh, that person knows what type of jeans I prefer to wear. I just send them to the store and say, buy me some jeans.
Yeah.
We don't approach any other relationship that way. So why should we approach an employer relationship with the assumption that they automatically know where our sensitivities lie? Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't, just like in the relationships we have in everyday life.
So it sounds like there might be three three categories here. You're either doing the ostrich thing, and I'm gonna tuck my head in, and I don't like this world. I don't want to deal with this new world. And I'll tell you a funny story. I'll tell you a funny story in just a second. The second option is pull up your big girl pants, pull up your big boy pants, be brave about the questions that you need to ask in order to be informed, and just choose the path of being an informed person about another human experience. And then the third one would be to call everything on the carpet, let everybody say what they need to say, and then constantly deal with whatever comes out of that. Or maybe it's kind of like a hybrid. Maybe I didn't bucket those kind of completely, but it sounds like if people did that, they might end up in less problems or fewer problems they might end up with fewer problems at the end and come and see you for more positive exchanges instead of negative exchanges. And actually, you're almost like I would like you to come in to do a proactive analysis on my company. If I'm a corporation hiring you these days, I'd be like, come in, LaDouglas. I want to make sure that I'm not going to fall into any traps because you see how to prevent them. You know, most attorneys, especially in labor law, they're like, wait till the discrimination shit hits the fan and I'm ready to, take on what I need to do. But that doesn't seem to be your train of thought. You seem to be very encouraging about how can we prevent this in the first place.
Right. Yeah, and the good companies do. And when I say good, I mean the companies that care about their employees, that care about making sure they create an environment where each employee can achieve their highest potential. They do those things proactively. And, you're not always going to be able to predict the future. And companies will grow and change over time, just like our culture will change over time. So there are going to be spots where you find out in the future, well, I didn't expect that to become a sensitivity, or I didn't see this coming. And what I say that to say, there's always a responsibility, even if you're being proactive to create that space and to educate yourself, you're going to become aware of things you don't know, because that's what the future is.
A bunch of things you don't know.
It's a bunch of stuff you don't know. Some of the things we expect because we know what's happened in the past, and we use that as a predictor of what's going to happen in the future, but it doesn't always line up perfectly. There are going to be surprises. There are going to be situations for you to proactively grow and to address unexpected situations that arise that you didn't ever expect in the first place.
So if I take away from the conversation that we've had so far for this part of like you're in the working environment. I'm coming into the work environment. This is my first job. Maybe my second job, or I'm just coming into a new company. I can champion change. I can come in and champion change just as much as the company can take responsibility in making that change happen. I think that's really the punchline here, is that it doesn't have to be eggshells. It doesn't have to be contentious. It doesn't have to be you're on your side of the fence as an employer and I'm on my side of the fence as an employee. I can be a steward of the world that I want to work in just as much as you're the steward of